The Roaring Twenties was an iconic decade of revolutionary Western society and culture. Women began to bob their hair, shorten their skirts, and voice their disdain for various restrictions and limitations to their rights. One of the most glaring issues was regarding women's reproductive health. Enter Margaret Sanger, one of 11 children born in upstate New York. After marrying and having children of her own, Margaret Sanger turned to radical politics and moved to Manhattan. During the time of flappers and liberated women, Sanger's introduction of feminism helped spur both the birth control movement and the women's rights movement. In 20th century America, women's bodies were heavily regulated. A patriarchal society oppressed women and their access to birth control, until Sanger pioneered the movements and communicated her ideas to an unreceptive, opposing general public. Subsequently, we came down to the question, to what extent did Margaret Sanger's communications influence the birth control movement and surrounding circumstances, and how are her actions still prevalent today? Sanger wasn't just simply a women's rights activist or involved in the medical community due to her role as such. In somewhat of a chain reaction, experiencing the death of her mother at a young age influenced Sanger to become a nurse, in which she encountered many more women like her mother, whose death was attributed to frequent pregnancies. Sanger understood the physical toll of having 11 children and wanted to show the importance of family planning and limitation. Her work as a visiting nurse allowed her to gain an extensive interest in sex education and women's health. In 1912, Margaret Sanger began writing a column on sex education titled, "What Every Girl Should Know." This experience led to her first struggle with censorship, as her column was deemed obscene. It was the issue of family limitation that attracted Sanger's attention as she worked in New York's Lower East Side with many poor women who were suffering from frequent childbirth, miscarriage, and harmful abortions. Sanger began to argue for the need for family limitation as a tool by which working-class women could liberate themselves from the economic burden of an unwanted pregnancy. Sanger was shocked by the inability of most women to obtain accurate and effective birth control, which she believed was fundamental to securing freedom and independence for women. She began to challenge the 1873 federal Comstock law that banned the dissemination of contraceptive information. In March 1914, Sanger published the first issue of The Woman Rebel, a radical feminist monthly that advocated militant feminism, as well as the right to practice birth control. She angered the Catholic hierarchy by breaking the law and sending The Woman Rebel through the United States Mail, which bore an anti-patriarchal slogan, "No gods, no masters." Postal officials confiscated her writings as violations of the anti-obscenity statutes of the Comstock Act. She was charged with violating the Comstock laws and fled to England. Before she left, she wrote the pamphlet Family Limitation, which included diagrams on the use of birth control. Industrial Workers of the World locals helped distribute the pamphlet, which sold 160,000 copies by 1917. She returned a year later to stand trial, but when her 5-year-old daughter died unexpectedly, public pressure led to charges being dropped.
In order to further our research, we interviewed Alexander Sanger, grandson of Margaret Sanger and current chair of International Planned Parenthood Council.
She was a woman who, against amazing opposition, almost universal opposition, took her vision of women being able to control their fertility, and she made it a reality in this country.
Mr. Sanger's statement is completely correct. Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in Brownsville, Brooklyn in 1916, for which a week later she was arrested and spent 30 days in jail. She appealed her conviction, and although she lost, the courts ruled that physicians could prescribe contraceptives to women for medical reasons, a loophole which allowed Sanger to open a clinic in 1923 staffed by female doctors and social workers, which would later become the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Margaret Sanger eventually shifted her focus into securing flexible state and federal laws, which was encouraged by a state court decision that loosened New York's anti-contraceptive laws. Also, by 1921, her publishing the Birth Control Review became the official organ of the American Birth Control League and included news of birth control activities along with articles by scholars, activists, and writers on birth control. In 1927, Sanger helped organize and spoke before the first World Population Conference in Geneva, Switzerland. She continued lobbying for freer state and federal laws and also for the widespread distribution of birth control knowledge through welfare programs. Sanger enlisted the help of fellow activist Catherine McCormick and biologist Gregory Pincus in making a birth control pill. After multiple trials of the pill in Puerto Rico, Haiti, and Mexico between 1956 and 1957, the FDA approved the sale of Enovid for use as an oral contraceptive. Before the time of Margaret Sanger and the introduction of safe and effective health care, many drug companies would advertise feminine hygiene as douches, some of which even contained Lysol. And a study in 1933 showed that 50% of women using those douches would still get pregnant.
A direct result of Sanger's influence can be seen in the landmark decision of Griswold v. Connecticut on June 7, 1965, when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Connecticut obscenity law that made the use of contraceptives a criminal offense, doing so on the grounds that the statute violated a constitutional right to marital privacy, which was the first time privacy was invoked in relation to sex. Although such a simple feat in the grand scale of fighting for both reproductive rights and women's rights, this meant birth control became legal nationwide just 5 years after the pill was approved for use as a contraceptive. Prior to this, the Connecticut affiliate of Planned Parenthood waged a polite but persistent campaign to repeal the anti-contraception law both in the legislature and in the courts for nearly 4 decades. The generation after this one went on to overturn the state's anti-abortion law. Due to the dramatically changed political landscape in response to the momentum gained by the women's liberation movement, they were able to win Einstad versus Baird in 1972, which granted unmarried people the same right to birth control. Unfortunately, opinion over women's reproductive rights, specifically abortion, is more divided today, even though support for the basic right has remained for decades. Since Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court has managed to restrict some of this degree of privacy by upholding state-imposed restrictions such as parental consent and waiting periods during the first trimester. However, the Supreme Court has continued to employ the standard set in Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992 that such regulations should not pose an undue burden on a woman's right to an abortion, seen most recently in Whole Woman's Health versus Hellerstedt in 2016, which invalidated a Texas law requiring clinic facilities to meet hospital standards and clinic doctors to hold admitting privileges at nearby hospitals. The first birth control pill was by no means the last, and developments continued since its introduction into society to improve it still. Today, about 30% of all women use birth control, making it America's most popular reversible method of contraception. And, compared to the effectiveness of the douche mentioned earlier, only 3 out of 1,000 women will become pregnant in the first year of use if used as directed. The pill is also used in the current era by women who prefer to have no periods, reduced menstrual flow, cramping relief, and for certain disorders and acne control. Margaret Sanger's continual fight for family planning, despite all of the challenges and opposition she faced along the way, made it legal to publish and distribute information about sex, sexuality, and birth control nationwide. She helped develop contemporary safe, effective, and affordable oral birth control pills and other hormonal methods, and made these accessible for poor women, women of color, and immigrant women. Her methods of activism became an early 20th century model for nonviolent civil disobedience, which further empowered the American civil rights, women's rights, anti-war, gay rights, and AIDS action movements. This model helped promote new ideas about volunteerism and grassroots organizing in the U.S. The history of fight for women's rights created the model for societal change that was followed by the later movements and has much to teach us about how to create a more equitable society.